We will resume the Clackamas County General Fund Budget Committee meetings. We have ready to speak to us today the folks from Juvenile Department. So Christina, take it away.
Good morning, Chair Parks and members of the Budget Committee. I'm Christina McMahon. I'm the Juvenile Department Director for Clackamas County. And with me today, I have Lisa Kurzmarzik, who has done a lot of work to put this budget together, along with Mark McDonald, who also did some heavy lifting. I was out on medical leave right in the middle of our budget season, so I'm really proud of the work that these two did, especially when we are in our transition year to go to the new format of Performance Clackamas. So they're here in case any questions come up that we need their assistance on. And then I'd also like to introduce Ed Jones, who's sitting back here. Ed is our new Administrative Services Manager. He started last week. So I anticipate I'll be talking a little bit about what Ed's going to be working on for us later in my presentation. So you'll be hearing more about that. So to start out, as I said, this is our first year doing the Performance Clackamas model of the budget. We had our strategic business plan approved in December of 2017. We've been really focused on ways that we can set up the infrastructure and utilize our resources to the best of our ability to achieve the results that we've identified in that plan. So this year is a transition year for us. So we're going from the old to the new. You will see we don't have a lot of prior information in this format because we never did this before. So I just wanted to let you know we expect that as our upcoming fiscal year begins and we start using this new model, that we will be making adjustments because we will understand it and we'll be able to develop it so that it actually aligns more with what we're really doing. So I don't want to say it's a guesstimate, it's much more than that, but it's our best guess to start out with. So moving on, this next slide, we, as part of our Performance Clackamas strategic business planning, we developed a new mission statement, which you can see before you. I think that one of the key things that we tried to focus on when we developed our mission statement was, per the model, identifying who our customers were. So at the Juvenile Department, we identified our customers as being youth, families, and victims. So you'll see some themes around that throughout this presentation. So values, I tried to we have a very long value statement, so I tried to shorten it up here and paraphrase what they really mean. So it's extremely important to us. One of our values is keeping youth connected to their home communities while maintaining safety for victims and the public. So there's a lot of research behind outcomes. If you can work with kids in the community and wrap services around them, they tend to have better long-term outcomes. So we try to do that. Delivering services that are equitable, effective, and respectful of the youth, families, and victims we serve, and providing opportunities for youth to repair harm to victims and communities, engage in positive community involvement, and to develop the skills necessary for a crime-free future. So I didn't put it as a value, but our kind of philosophy that underlies every decision that we make is we're really asking ourselves to kind of put it to the test of if this was my child, would this be good enough? And we think about that because every single youth who comes to our department is somebody's child, and it matters how we make our policies and how we allocate our resources. So here under services, in the next slide, you'll see that we've aligned our lines of business so that they actually match up with the Oregon Revised Statute's purpose clause for juvenile justice in Oregon. So according to the statute, it says the system is founded on the principle of personal responsibility, accountability, and reformation within the context of public safety. So when you look at our structure, you'll see in the green boxes our 4 lines of business, 3 out of 4, are directly lifted from that purpose clause. So the first 3, going from the left, public safety, reformation, and accountability, and then of course we have to have administration to make all that happen, hopefully. Each line of business has two, we didn't try to do it this way, it just worked out this way, two different programs within the lines of business. As we are moving through this, we anticipate this could change. We might end up condensing some programs, or we might end up adding some programs as we go through this next year. So I wanted to make sure that you had a good understanding of some baseline information about who our department is serving. So I'm not going to get into a lot of detail, but I thought it was important for you to know. In Clackamas County, there are actually 42,000 youth between the ages of 10 and 17. So that's our eligible population of who could potentially come to our department. What actually happens is we average about 1,400 referrals of youth to our department. So 1,400 out of 42,000. So that's and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. And then on any given day, if you walked into our building and you said, hey, how many kids do you have on your caseload? If you went around to all the people that have caseloads, we average somewhere between 350 and 400 kids that we are serving directly from our staff providing services or through contracted services like diversion. So, and then the last thing is we talk about all of these things, but the reality is juvenile justice isn't a standalone system. We depend a great deal on many other systems. It's really a multi-system process. So what isn't reflected there is we literally work with hundreds of public safety partners, school partners, nonprofit partners, citizens in the community who volunteer and help us. So that's not reflected in this, but it's really important. We couldn't do the work we do if we didn't have those relationships. Okay. So this slide represents the 3-year trend for our department, or actually the previous 2 years, and what we're proposing for this year. And you can see that as far as our general fund contribution, it went up by about $180,000, and that is because of the increase that we had for maintenance. That's what made up that. We didn't get new revenue sources other than that. Okay. Okay, so this one, oh, the colors look so different up here. Okay. As you can see from the resources chart, the majority of our resource comes from County General Fund. This year we're at 63%. We did have some changes in our resources. We had a small federal grant that we've gotten in previous years, and we weren't allowed to accept that this year because of some issues that everyone is aware of going on with the strings tied to the federal money. So fortunately, we were able to move some things around. That grant funded skills groups with kids, and we were able to reallocate within our own budget to make that happen. So we did not have to cut our service levels because fortunately it was a small grant. We no longer have the juvenile ops trust fund. I'm going to talk a lot about that in the last slide of this presentation, so I'm going to kind of skip that for now. So that's, sorry, I forgot. Requirements. As you can see from the expenditures side, not surprisingly, personnel services is 54% of our budget. We are in the business of working directly with young people and their families and victims. The other major areas that we spend money on, materials and services represents 40%, and that's because we contract out for several services that either we don't have the ability to provide ourselves, or it makes more sense to have community providers provide those services. So for example, our biggest contract in our budget is with Multnomah County to fund the detention beds that we rent at the Donald D. Long Juvenile Justice Complex. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Well, I'm going to talk about it now, actually. It makes sense. We've been paying, we have a contract and it goes up. It's tied, the daily bed rate is tied to the consumer index, and it goes up every year depending on what's going on with that. So our daily bed rate for this year was $300 a day. We finally broke the $300 barrier. Now it's $309. So that's clearly a big, so that overall amount that we invest in detention is, for this fiscal year, it was $1,861,000. And if we had to make some cuts because we couldn't operate within our resources without making cuts somewhere in our budget. So we looked at the data from our utilization of detention, and we decided to go ahead and cut 2 detention beds. So instead of having access to 17 beds on any given day, we will now have access to 15 beds. And we will still, the access, the way it currently is set up, the sheriff does an interfund transfer and pays for one of those beds, and the other 16 are, our beds. We've never treated it that way. We just manage the beds to meet the needs. So we've had times we've had no Measure 11 juveniles that are being detained, and other times we've gone up to 5 at a time. So we just make that work, and our intention is to continue to make that work. We're not going to go to the sheriff and try to get him to pay for additional beds because we believe we can manage it. So that's something that had an impact on us this year in the proposed budget. Next, the changes in full-time equivalents positions. So you can see here on the first bullet, realignment of the FTE with our new performance Clackamas lines of business. We actually started doing that in our presentation last year, and we've done that even more. We actually added, I know you heard about this yesterday when Rich Swift and Mary Rumba were here from H3S. We actually added another student threat assessment coordinator after the school year started. And it was really important to, now looking back, we didn't know everything that would happen this winter and the spring. We did know that there was an increase in school violence and violence being committed in or around schools. So we knew that that was something important when we came together almost 2 years ago, the sheriff, H3S, and Juvenile, to talk about, hey, how do we combat this? How can we take the best practice model and implement it throughout try to implement it in 11 different school districts throughout the county. So I'm really proud of the work that we've done. It's been a lot of planning, a lot of people contributing to that. And I know yesterday there was a question, or Mary brought up about the multidisciplinary team that is meeting to staff these kids. And I remember her saying that that team brings resources to the table. So the point of this is we're trying to get ahead of the really bad things happening. We're trying to be proactive, and we're trying to be proactive in intervening, and we're also trying to focus on preventing things. So sometimes things have already happened, but we don't want them to escalate. So it's pretty impressive since March when this started. Prior to March, they were doing a lot of training. They offered over 20 trainings throughout the county, and they trained over 450 people on this threat assessment protocol. And then in March, they were ready to go live, and they actually have staffed 25, they've had 25 staffing meetings. And in some of those meetings, they're only staffing one child, and other times they're staffing multiple kids, depending on what's going on. So in less than 3 months, that's really impressive. People are really committed and coming to the table. So that's a service that I think has added a lot of value, not just for our department, but for kids in the school, teachers, staff feeling safe. Okay. The proposed budget, once again, by line of business or program. So we did ours by line of business, and I just want to reemphasize this is a transition year. After we submitted this, we're all kind of looking at it again, and we're saying, oh, maybe it makes sense to put that over here. So I anticipate this will change and be adjusted and fine-tuned as we go along. But for now, the 4 divisions, as you can see, administration 19, public safety 24, reformation 31, accountability 26. Accountability is the one that's most often associated with probation officers, and we have a lot of probation officers who work in our department. Okay, now the fun stuff. I'm a data person, so I actually really enjoy this format. Diane was kind of laughing at me because I told her I had to curb my enthusiasm. So this,
There's a movie by that name.
yes, I know, I'm not very original, but so on the first line here, it says reduction in juvenile recidivism. So in the high level performance measures for the whole county, this reduction in juvenile recidivism, it says that the target is to reduce that to 17% by 2020. So what we actually did, because we kind of didn't understand and we could have filled this in, which is fine because I'm going to fill you in right now. Our most recent available recidivism data, our recidivism is always a year behind. So it's for 2016, and it just was released in March of 2018 because they have to have a full year to see if the youth reoffends, and then there has to be time to analyze the data and make sure that it's accurate, and then it is published on the JJIS, Juvenile Justice Information System website. So our most recent recidivism data for 2016 was 19.9 as our rate. Just to give you a little bit of a comparison, the statewide average for the same year was 27.7. So we are substantially behind the state, below the statewide average. And we actually have the lowest recidivism of any large or medium county in the state. Some of the smaller counties have very tiny ends that they're working with. So if they have one kid and that kid doesn't reoffend, they have zero recidivism. So just to kind of put it in perspective. So that's the first one. Restitution, our target, we put fiscal year 18-19 target. That's actually 95% is our target, but that is our target that we listed, as you can see in the middle column there. 95% of all youth successfully complete their restitution obligation. That is very important to victims to receive restitution when they've been harmed, and the vast majority of kids we work with in our county are property offenders. So typically, we do have some other types of offenses, but typically property offenders are causing some kind of damage, and there's restitution. So even though the target in our plan for 2021 is to achieve 95%, we feel like we want to just keep it at 95% as our target because we have more control over that. And we don't control everything, but we are supervising the kids. We can zoom in and look for gaps and why maybe our rate isn't as high as we want it. But the good news is, for 2017, our data is 86% collection of all restitution. The statewide average is 72.3. So even though we haven't hit our target, once again, we're well above the statewide average. And then let's see, result, 98% of youth ages 10 to 17 in Clackamas County do not become involved in the juvenile justice system. So this measure is really we have a high-level strategic result that's tied to prevention activities. Our department historically has had some prevention activity, but hasn't been focused directly on prevention. So when we redid our mission statement, we added prevention. So we wanted to come up with a measure to try to capture it. Obviously, we can't claim responsibility for all the other good work that's going on in the county that helps prevent kids from coming to our system. But we started with, at the beginning of the presentation, I told you that there are 42,000 kids in Clackamas County. So our rate right now is, for 2017, is 96.7. So we're already pretty close to that mark. And if we continue to focus on prevention, I don't think we'll ever get it to 100%, but I think we can even improve it and get up to that 98%. I don't think that's impossible. So, key performance measures and results. Okay. This is, you can see from the slide, developing and implementing reliable data collection. It's hard to report if you don't have data that you can rely on. We have been working on a big project that's a multi-year project to migrate data that we have from an old kind of sidebar system into the juvenile justice information system. We have, in the handouts here, that I gave a bunch of handouts. On the top one in that stack, there's an article about the Georgetown Center for Juvenile Justice Reform coming to Oregon and holding their evidence-based decision-making certificate program. That was an amazing opportunity. We did that. Clackamas County was instrumental in bringing it to Oregon, and it is going to position us very well to hopefully accomplish the things that we've set out to accomplish. So there's more information on that. So youth and family engagement, one of our high-level strategic results that we're focused on is improving family engagement, inclusion, respecting parents as experts on their own children, having their voice involved in everything we're doing with their kids. So that's something that we're focused on. And we're also focused on the diversity of the kids and families that we're working with. So one of the things that's just come out in the last year is, and this is in your packet, it's the second item down, is the new Juvenile Justice Information System, Racial and Ethnic Disparities Relative Rate Index report. And so I'm really proud. I attached the kind of definitions to help understand this stuff. But to cut to the chase, if you go to the last page, it's a way of measuring disparities at different decision points in the criminal justice and delinquency system. And we have, at this point, no disparities. We've leveled the playing field. To be fair, we don't have a lot of diversity yet, but our Hispanic population is growing and represents about 14% of the youth that we serve. So I also handed out in this packet the good news, hot off the press, our Good News Clackamas County Juvenile Department newsletter. This has a lot of information around how we collaborate. There's an article here that quotes some of the kids that are participating in some of our groups. I thought it would be helpful for you to have an example of some of those collaborations. Some of the things, I'm just going to list them off because I'm running out of time. Some of the things that we have partnered in with the community, volunteering and interning. We have a lot of people who contribute to our work. We have actually for this fiscal year 3,860 hours valued at approximately $96,000. So that's almost the equivalent of 2 full-time employees, people coming in doing a lot of different things. We've been actively involved in the Student Threat Assessment Partnership, the Commercially Sexually Exploited Children's Partnership, and several other pilots assisting law enforcement to transport kids to our assessment centers so that kids can get more timely access to services and their families. So those are some of the collaborations. In the last one, building prevention capacity, we are doing a lot of work with the schools. We actually go into the schools and work with them to train them up to be able to do different groups to address problematic behavior of kids who haven't yet been referred to our department. So let's see, and then the last slide, emerging issues. Juvenile Justice Information System, the last handout I gave is on the JGIS modernization project. JGIS was created in 1996 through a partnership with the 36 counties and the Oregon Youth Authority, and it is now getting to the point where it can't be maintained. The platform it was built on is pretty soon not going to be able to be serviced. So this is a big issue to us because if the modernization project isn't funded by the legislature, we literally could end up one day having a system that's crashed and we would have no ability to operate, essentially. This is embedded in all of the work that we do. We access JGIS, and it's a statewide system. So as you can imagine, in the metro region, we have a lot of kids who move around between the 3 counties. So being able to look and see that the kid we have in our 24-hour intake and assessment center is actually on probation in Washington County and understand some of the dynamics is pretty critical. So that's a big one that's looming. So let's see, next, depletion of the Juvenile Ops Fund. We had utilized over the last several years a fund that had been put aside. It was from a federal earmark that the Juvenile Department got to hopefully someday build a detention center, but it was allowed that this money could be used for juvenile operations. It was set aside. We got it in the early 2000s. It wasn't used until like about the last 5 years ago. Started pulling money in from that fund to make up for gaps in the resources we had and the requirements we needed. So basically, we were living off a savings account, and that this year was the last year that that fund was available to us. So that we don't have it in the upcoming fiscal year. We did have significant salary savings, which is how we could maintain the current service levels, but we anticipate this time next year we will not be in that same situation. So that'll be something that we'll have to have more conversations about. And then 2019 legislative session, there was a pretty intense and critical report by Disability Rights of Oregon that came out talking about the Norcore detention facility located in the Dalles. It didn't just focus on that, it actually focused on juvenile justice in a lot of different ways, and we've been alerted. I've spoken to folks at PGA. There is a growing movement to have some legislation at the next full session to try to deal with the problems with juvenile justice. So we don't know what that will bring, whether that'll bring extra mandates or reductions or reshuffling of how things are funded. So that's just a big question mark, but it's definitely something that could impact us greatly. So I'm sorry I went over a couple of minutes here. Thank you for your patience with that, and happy to answer any and all questions that you have.
Thank you very much. As you can see, we do have a number of questions from the committee. We're going to start with Commissioner Humberston, and then we have Mr. Magdalene, then Commissioner Bernard, Commissioner Schrader, and Mr. Feely.
I have a number of questions. Do you directly, or do you have referral to parenting skills for those parents that
Yes.
might be part of the problem?
Yes, we do have
they are
two
occasionally.
different kinds of parenting classes that we have access to, we contract for.
On what basis do you judge recidivism?
The statewide definition for county juvenile departments is re-referral to a juvenile department within 1 year of your original referral. That's the standard definition. We also, I didn't include them in this slide. When I say re-referral, I mean for a criminal offense. So if a youth is picked up for a curfew violation, that would not be considered recidivism. But if they commit an actual misdemeanor or a felony, it would be.
So when you say a referral, I want to define that, or make sure I know the definition. Does that mean that the youth has, to use an adult term, been convicted of that offense, or
No.
just referred?
It is more, you can equate it more to an arrest. If a youth has been rearrested within a year of that first offense. So a
And what-
referral in our world means law enforcement had contact and they referred the kid to our department either by bringing them into our 24-hour facility or sending us the police report.
And if he wasn't, quote, convicted of the offense, it's still considered a recidivism statistic?
Yes.
Okay. I have always had an issue with that because whether it's adult or juvenile, but I understand. I just want to know what your basis was, so thank you for that. If I was looking at your numbers, if I understood it correctly, you have 13 officers doing direct supervision. Am I correct on that?
Let me pull up that sheet. Oh, you're looking at the,
budget stuff.
are you looking at the actual budget
Yeah, the budget
pages with the structure by lines of business?
Yeah, and it shows a supervision services of 13.
Yeah. Let me just let me get to the page.
Pages.
Right, so we have,
Page 3?
Right.
Yeah.
so, yes, supervision services for formal, when we say supervision services here, we're referring to formal supervision, the youth that actually are placed on probation by the court and have to appear in front of the juvenile court judge. So we have 13 officers who handle that caseload. We also have informal supervision, and those folks are located in, so we call those formal accountability agreements. They're supervising them, offering services, meeting with the family, but they don't actually have a formal petition filed in juvenile court. Those folks are housed under custody services.
So the officers doing direct supervision, how many are in their caseloads? And what is the frequency of contact?
Well, the caseloads, the contact is set depending on the risk levels of the kids. So we do a validated risk assessment, which helps us to determine the risk level. And then contact is more intense, more frequent if they're high risk versus if they're low risk. So to answer your question about caseloads, that's fluctuated a lot over the years. And right now we're hovering at right around 20, I'm talking about probation, right around 20 cases per juvenile court counselor is the caseload size.
That's pretty nice. I
was gonna
worked in
say-
a department where we had as many as 600.
Right, so,
I kind of wanted to make sure you had
Yours just
a manageable caseload.
Right.
Because obviously with 600, you're just banking cases. You're not
Right.
really doing real supervision, so.
no, we are fortunate, we have the ability, we have the capacity to do very high-quality work with those youth.
That shows in some of your statistics, by the way. And then my last question is, you talked about a threat of harm assessments.
Yes.
And my question on that is that focused on suicide ideation or threats to others, or both?
It's actually the student, when I was referring to it, and I'm sorry if I used too much shorthand there, it's the student threat assessment work. So that's the school safety work. So it's focused, sometimes we do have youth who are threats at school, and they are also suicidal, but it's really focused on kids who are committing violent acts in school or threatening to shoot or coming up with plans, those types of things.
So mostly outward rather than inward.
Right.
Okay.
But I did reference the assessment piece when I was talking about the transport pilot that we're doing with law enforcement, because we want to increase utilization of our juvenile intake and assessment center, because when kids are brought into that program, they actually get a suicide assessment. We have access to Riverstone crisis services. We do a mental health assessment. We do suicide. We do self-harm. So that I was talking about suicide without really articulating it very well, because that is a big issue with our population.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
A little bit of an expansion on the student threat assessment. Is that being rolled out? Is that Salem, Kaiser model?
Yes, it is.
And it's being, how many districts are currently using it here in county?
I believe we are at 10 out of 11 currently. We have one district that's not using that model yet.
Okay. And that, any idea that, I think the Education Service District brought a person in to help with that as well. And I just.
Yes, that partnership our partnership has been with the Clackamas ESD. So this year they contributed $15,000 towards helping fund that new position that we added to our budget.
Okay.
Yeah.
In the beginning, you talked about the services that are needed and are in high demand. What are the high demand services? What are they going for? And helping the student or the child out?
So are you talking about in the student threat assessment context or in
Well,
general?
not going down to your values, or in the very beginning, you talked about a demand for services.
Right.
And I'm trying to understand what is the top two or three of those services, and how are they fulfilled?
Right. Well, so in our world and in our strategic plan, we talk about families facing a myriad of complex issues that they're trying to deal with all at once. So I would say the top driver and most intense and high-risk situations tend to involve kids who have varying degrees and different types of mental health, behavioral health issues. And a lot of what we see with the student threat assessment work is unmet behavioral health needs, because they just haven't had access to that resource. So For us, it's trying to figure out how to individually assess what each youth needs and getting them that. So number one, if we had our staff in here and you could take a straw poll, they would all say behavioral health, because we don't have, what ends up happening, for example, is we have kids who have significant needs. They're untreated. They haven't had an opportunity to have access to psychiatric medications. They do something really serious, and then they get defaulted to go to detention so they can be safely held, so they're not hurting other people. But in reality, from a trauma-informed approach, sitting in detention is one of the worst things that you can have happen if you're a mentally ill young person. So I've literally had, earlier this year, I was walking through the department late on a Thursday night, and I noticed one of my staff's light was on, and it was like almost 9 o'clock at night. And I went in and I asked her, hey, what's going on? Is everything okay? And she was on the phone, putting notes in the computer, doing everything she could to try to get services for a very, a young man who had he had blown out of so many different treatments. He had substance abuse issues. He had untreated mental health issues. And she literally, I sat down with her, she started crying. She said, this young man, I feel like the system is putting him on a path that he's going to go to adult prison. We're setting him up because we don't have the right thing. So the reality is, in Oregon, we don't have access to enough crisis psychiatric beds for kids, and the default of how to deal with these kids is to put them in the juvenile justice system. So DHS constantly puts kids in residential placement. They end up, because they have had such a trauma history, they go into these placements, and a lot of times they act out and they might throw a laptop or punch a staff or shove a staff, and somebody gets hurt, and then boom, they get a juvenile delinquency referral, and they come to our department, and now all of a sudden we're trying to figure out what we're going to do to help this young person. And too many times they end up in detention, or they end up being committed to the Oregon Youth Authority because it's the last resort option and there's nothing else. So I think hands down, the different levels of mental health. And then the other issue is we have parents. I do not want to make this sound like all parents are bad or have mental health issues, but there's often a lot of things that have gone on in a family, and the parents themselves have experienced a lot of things, and they aren't necessarily equipped. They don't have the tools yet to be able to respond appropriately to support their kids. It's not that they don't love them and they don't want to do that. They literally don't have the tools. So it's not just dealing with the youth in isolation. A lot of times it's dealing with the support system. So it's such a problem that the governor put together a short-term task force that's supposed to figure this out in the next few months. It's called, the name of the task force is Children with Specialized Needs. And it crosses over juvenile justice, mental health, the schools, developmental disabilities. What I'm telling you is not a unique Clackamas story. It's every county story. So.
And you're actually one of the few agencies that address the issue. In other words, you don't get it through the schools, or you don't get it through. You think of services, you think of housing, but you also think of the food pantries, the backpack buddies, and
right.
And it's very specialized, I guess is the best way to put it. And it's in your hands.
Right, but I actually think when Mary Rumbo was here yesterday and she talked about the staffings of the new student threat assessment team, the multidisciplinary team, and she was pretty clear. She said, you don't get just to come to the, I'm paraphrasing, but you don't get to come to the meeting and talk about wringing your hands about how horrible the situation is. You're expected to pony up resources. So when you get people together in the same room, focused on what can we do that's best for this youth and this family, exactly what you said. Oh, I know of food pantry. I mean, last night I was at the Community Impact Awards with all of the commissioners, and I heard about a nonprofit that's doing this amazing work to get people that are addicted into residential program. I was blown away by that story. So sometimes there's amazing resources in this county, but we don't always have a full inventory of what everyone's doing. So then when you get around the table, people share, oh, I know of this organization. So what we're trying to do with the student threat assessment is look at those complex needs and figure out what can we do to wrap around services to keep this kid from harming himself, others, or on that trajectory to adult prison that we don't want to see happen. So.
Okay, and then on the detention beds or the beds that you're renting, I didn't quite understand how much occupancy you have there. Do you have what? So could you give us a little more color on that? So, or I'll put it in language I understand.
Okay, so since we don't have our own detention facility in Multnomah, we have been renting for the last several years 17 beds. So what we are guaranteed that on any given day, we have access to those 17 beds. So what that means is Multnomah can't fill them up and then say to us, oh, too bad, you can only put 13 kids in today when we need 17. So we pay for that access, which, as you can see, is expensive. And that means we can't, we're basically capped. If we were to go over 17 kids, we would have to, under the statute, we'd have to come up with a population release plan and release kids according to that. We haven't had to do that. We have an agreement with Clackamas County. They also, not Clackamas, Washington County. Washington and Clackamas have a cooperative agreement. We each rent beds, and if we're not using all of ours and they're over, we let them use theirs. If we're approaching or over, they let us use theirs if they have them available. So we've been able to manage it really well over, a long time that we've been doing this. So years and years, way before me. So what we found was if we had to make a cut, where we had underutilization was we've hovered between 10 and 11 kids on average. Our average daily population for the year has been 10 or 11 kids. So we thought we could safely cut down to 15. It's still scary because we have spikes. We will get a day where we have 17 kids, and our average for that day isn't going to be 10 or 11. So we're going to have to adjust to that as we go along, and that's part of the work that we're doing anyway with our Performance Clackamas plan. Our goal isn't to come here and report to you, we're so happy, we overutilized detention, give us more money so we can increase that contract. Our goal is to try to help kids be successful in the community so they don't end up there. So
Thank you very much.
you're welcome.
Commissioner Bernard. And then just a reminder, we have 3 more who would like to ask questions or comment after that. And I know we're going to be a little bit over time, so we just want to be as courteous to the timeframes as possible. Thank you.
You answered my first one on the 309. They reserve, you pay that every day through the whole year. My question actually has to do with Parrot Creek, which is somebody you also contract with and
Yes.
you rent beds from, I assume.
Those are shelter beds in the community, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how much do you rent? You rent those beds?
Yes, we pay, that's what's called a behavioral rehabilitative services program. So the state has set a rate. We pay them that rate, which is approximately $180 a day, but we're able to bill Medicaid and get partial reimbursement for that.
Okay. So do you have any idea what population of Clackamas County youth are in Parrot Creek facility versus others?
Yeah, actually I do, because they operate the shelter program and then they operate their residential program. Our contract is for the shelter program. And we use about 4 beds on average of their 6-bed capacity. The Oregon Youth Authority frequently uses those other 2 beds, and then they use the residential program because we don't commit kids. Oregon Youth Authority does, and then they place them in that program. So
Okay, so
about a
the
third.
houses up on top are the what, residential?
Shelter.
The shelter.
And so the other parts, residential, meaning the kids stay there. And that's the one you said they have more than 6 beds, but,
Right, I think they're,
About 18 total.
I thought it was.
and how many
16.
of those beds are used by Clackamas County?
Well, those are
Okay.
contracted for by the state, and sometimes we will commit a kid to the Oregon Youth 30, and they will end up at Parrot Creek. But the constellation of who is in there from what county changes frequently.
Okay, the reason I ask is I go to those where Ann is assigning somebody or past judges have, but generally speaking, it's the youth that kind of decides what they want to do. Do you want to go there or not? Our concern is, it's interesting that the youth authority actually assigns those people, not Clackamas County, even though it's in our county and we're paying for the maintenance of it. And as far as I'm concerned, we have very little control over how the youth are controlled, I guess, or managed.
Just, let's just say that there's a little bit to be desired in terms of
Programming.
And I know
supervision.
that's not your issue as much as it is ours, but I just wanted to make sure. I happen to think it's a great program. I just happen to think there are issues with the facility that need to be addressed somehow in this county. But it really sounds like in this state, not just this county, because those kids are from everywhere.
That's true.
All right, thanks.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. Commissioner Schrader?
I had a question about the whatever. You know what I'm talking about.
Recidivism.
Say that word.
People that do it again.
Let's say, I know, people that do it again, or kids that do it again. So you say there's a 1-year time frame. So if they get through a year, but then they commit a crime the following year, it starts all over again.
No,
No?
it's rolling. So no.
It's rolling.
Right, in
So-
fact, we have another term, we call it chronic recidivism, which are the frequent flyers who reoffend 3 or more times within a year of each other.
People who
So-
do it whole bunches of times.
So it's not a calendar year, it's
Just
just
stop, Ken.
your
It's
year.
so bad. You're such a corrections officer. And then some specifics. I thought, what types of crimes are these youngsters committing? Does it vary by age? You have like this range of 10 to 17. I mean, what, are we talking about burglary? Are we talking about?
Right, we're talking
assault?
about
Are we talking-
very few, it's about 80% of the crimes committed by kids in this county are property crimes or public order, like disorderly conduct, those types of offenses. A very small portion are person crimes. So very tiny amount, it's in the less than 20 referrals a year for juvenile sex offenders, kids who've actually committed sex offenses, which are really some of the most serious crimes that we deal with. And we do have some assaults, but they're typically the lowest level assaults, which are misdemeanors. They're called assault fours, schoolyard fights. We do once in a while get a felony level assault, but that is really uncommon. So vast majority are misdemeanors and property crimes.
Right, and again, the age?
Oh,
Does it-
it's,
Does it vary by age or is it just
yeah,
across the
so
board?
that,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I skipped over
No.
that. The 10 to 17 is what we call the potential population. But in Oregon, we really don't start formally filing in court until a kid is 12 years old. By statute, we could file any age we wanted to, but the practice is we don't do that. So we do have programs in our department, one of the few in the state, to serve those younger kids that are getting in trouble. Typically, it's misdemeanor, vandalism, graffiti, lowest levels of theft. It's pretty rare to see younger kids that are committing felony level crimes. It happens sometimes, but it's not very common. The older teenagers, the 15, 16, 17-year-old crowd, are doing the burglaries, unlawful use of a motor vehicle, taking somebody else's car without permission
Fighting, yeah.
is a felony. We see a lot of those.
In terms of behavioral health, are you talking about kids that probably are exhibiting things like schizophrenia, depression? What again, is there a preponderance of one form
No,
of mental illness over another? I mean, I know this is complex, but is it, a kid having a psychic, pretty much a.
Yep, every single thing you
reality.
said,
Yeah.
we see, kids can't be diagnosed with schizophrenia. They can be identified as likely to be schizophrenic, but while they're in adolescence, they can't have a formal diagnosis for that. So we see a lot of bipolar, manic, a lot of post-traumatic stress disorder. It runs the gamut.
And post-traumatic stress from a family environment or
Right,
trauma?
a lot of the kids have significant trauma histories, and they've developed PTSD because of that.
Functional
So
families.
we see the full range.
And then the final comment, when you talk about parents, not having tools to deal, and having raised children,
Yeah.
some my own and some, that come through. I mean, so what are you talking about in terms of parenting skills? Lack of structure, lack of food, lack of an appropriate place to sleep, lack
All of the above.
Well, sometimes,
what,
right,
when people need tools, what are they missing? I mean, it doesn't, yeah.
every single thing you just said. Sometimes people have, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. They don't have their basic needs met, and they're in survival mode, just trying to figure out where the next meal is coming from. Are we going to be evicted? Are we going to be living in our car? Are we going to be homeless? I mean, we have a lot of families that have gone through all kinds of poverty-related experiences. Then we have families that have the parents have their own trauma history, and when their child is acting out, they don't have they actually are triggered by their own children, and they don't have the skills to respond. So some of the things that we try to do are making sure that we're getting families hooked up to the appropriate level of care in terms of family counseling, wraparound services. We have parenting classes. Really kind of depends where they fall on the spectrum of needs. Sometimes we're trying to help them get resources, referring them to resources to deal with the hierarchy of needs issues. But a lot of domestic violence situations, incarcerated parents. I mean, the kids who end up in our system are the highest risk on so many different levels and so many different scales in a lot of ways.
And final comment now with the issues, the severe issues we've been dealing with across this nation with school violence. And when you talk about threat assessments, is that actually helping to identify some of those indicators of a
Yes.
young person who is likely to commit that level of harm and crime?
Yes, and that's why that multidisciplinary team structure is so important, because people come around the table and share information and can identify kids who, wow, we need to do something. We can't just assume this is a one-time only event. So yes, to answer your question, the protocol does help identify kids that, what's normal adolescent behavior versus what's scary and
What's going
dangerous.
off the grid and really going to really murder people.
Right.
In a sense. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Commissioner Schrader. Mr. Feely?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want you to talk a little bit about prevention and preventing juveniles from entering your system. We talked with the H3S people yesterday about the lack of adequate behavioral
Right.
health services in the school. And I volunteer at a grade school, so I work with second and fifth graders twice a week. I see that need, whether or not it's that the child hasn't been adequately assessed, whether the parents don't have health insurance to get the assessment and the treatment. In the meantime, the teacher is dealing with 35 kids, and it's just not getting addressed. And these are your future clients. So,
Exactly.
well, what can we do collectively to keep them from becoming your future clients?
Well, we have already started doing some things, and our hope is that we can expand some of the things that we've started. So in Clackamas County, we have partnered in every school district in the county to either go in and do different types of skills groups. So anger management type groups, girls circle, boys council, cognitive behavioral, for kids that have not yet been referred to our department, but the school personnel are saying, so to get to what you just said, being a volunteer in elementary school, thank you for doing that. I have a third grader at home, and I know how important volunteers are at that school. You know, what we haven't been able to do is get in, we've focused on middle school and high school, but eventually we would love
Yeah.
to be able to get
Because
in.
it's happening there. I mean, I can see by the second week of school,
Yes.
you know, how the kid acts.
Right, so our capacity, we're in approximately 30 different school settings. We either go in and do the groups, or we partner with them to train up and co-facilitate groups with their own internal staff who are going to take that on. So from a sustainability model, that's helped to spread it to 30 schools. But our hope is that we can get in, as part of our strategic business planning, we talked about getting upstream, because if we don't turn down the faucet of what's,
Exactly.
who is coming to us, then we get kids when they're so,
Well, they're kind of locked in at that
Yes,
point. I mean,
they're already-
going down the path.
right, they're already halfway there to the
Right.
deep end of the system. So that's why we included prevention in our strategic
Well, I
business plan.
appreciate that. I was
Yeah,
happy to see that.
The other thing that is uncomfortable sometimes for people to talk about, but it goes on, very young kids that are under 12 who we wouldn't normally take to court, we have a very well-established prevention program in Clackamas County that is based on a multidisciplinary team of folks who come together to look at younger, 11 and younger, who are engaged in sexually abusive behavior. And those kids, if that isn't dealt with, if there's a lot of research that if you get those kids the help and services they need when they're young, they don't end up coming to our system. But most counties don't have that resource. We actually have, we provide services to those younger, non-juvenile department referred kids. And we work with about 10 other agencies on that. So that's one of our prevention
Thank you.
pieces.
Ms. Caldwell?
Thank you. Excuse me. My last 10 years at Multnomah County, I worked with the Department of Community Justice, of which Juvenile Services is a part. Sadly, just as I left, Christina came into Multnomah County, and I've heard so many good things about the work that she did there, so.
Thank you.
I'm glad you're now at Clackamas County. And I also wanted to make the point that I remember hearing that often the kids' relationship with their juvenile counselor, the kids in probation, is the most positive adult relationship that they have in their lives. And sometimes they keep those relationships even after they've left the system. So I just want to make sure people understand that that's the services they're providing. I wanted to ask you, did I read somewhere that you're using the EPICS model in your probation services?
Yes, Clackamas County was the second county in the state to implement EPICS. Most of the juvenile departments in the state are using EPICS. I believe it was 2011 that they implemented it. So yes, and so yes, our staff and managers have been trained on EPICS, and we are utilizing it.
And it's working well? You're
Well,
happy with?
that's one of those data questions. When I got here, I said, so how do we know any of this is working? Which is why we're so excited about the Georgetown learning opportunity that we had, which we will be engaged in for the next few years, because there's a focus on how do you really know what you're doing is being effective? How do you have that quality assurance? And so, so we have never, as a department, done any sort of study or evaluation of EPICS. So I see that coming down the road.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
We have Commissioner Savas and then Commissioner Fisher.
Actually, I think it was Commissioner Fisher first.
Was it? Okay, we'll go that way then. Thank you very much, Commissioner Savas.
First of all, I want to commend you on the language that you use in describing youth with challenges in their families. It's very refreshing to see the strength-based, positive frame. I recognize that immensely wasn't that way 20 years ago. It's just wonderful to hear the way that you describe the services you provide. I have a sort of a technical question. I recall, and I may have remembered incorrectly when I became a county commissioner and I did the tour and met with you,
Yes.
that the cost of the beds in Multnomah were about $185 a night.
No.
Is that wrong?
That's wrong. They've
Okay.
been in the high 200s for climbing up for several years. Around 185 is it's I think 182 and 90 cents or something for the beds, the shelter beds that we
Okay,
rent.
so I just
through.
remembered it wrong. I was just
Yeah.
curious if that was true a year and a half ago. It's like, oh my gosh, why did it increase so much?
Yeah.
That was my only question.
Okay, thank you very much. Commissioner Salvis?
So you like data?
Yes.
I like data too.
Tell us something we don't know, Paul.
So, and I've always had a hard time wrapping my brain around all the different nuances of how recidivism is measured. And so when it comes to, you mentioned 12 to 17, and I know that there's limits on what can be recorded and stay with the youth. And then when they turn 18,
Right.
is there anything that actually tracks them as they become adults and marries their youth recidivism rate or government's success rate and does that tracking so that you can look at an 18-year-old or 19-year-old and say they've been maybe in the system, so to speak, from maybe age 15 onwards? How are we doing with that particular individual or those groups of individuals with those? Is there tracking for that?
No, that's on a statewide level through this JAGES system. There is not currently the capability to reach in and interact with the adult system so that you can access all those data sets and be able to answer the question that you just said. However, at a county level, we have been working on partnerships with other public safety partners. This year, we were able to purchase Tableau, which is a data visualization dashboard system. We're entering into agreements with adult community corrections, so to get to what you're talking about, so that we can share information and we will be able to follow. I want to know if a youth graduates from our system, do they go on to the adult system? And if so, what level of crime? Do they, adolescent brain development, kids don't finish, their brains don't finish growing, they say, till they're in their mid-20s. So do they go on and do kind of those underdeveloped brain kind of crimes, or do they keep going and commit more serious crimes? So there is no statewide way currently to do that, but we at the county, if you have the resources to do that, and we're lucky, we have two designated data folks in our department, we are going to be doing just that, because that to me is really important. We're the feeder system for the adult system. So we need to know if we're actually overfeeding that system. And right now, nobody can answer that.
Well, that was my concern. And yesterday, H3S was up here, and we just touched on briefly, I think one of my questions related to mental health and so forth, and knowing that there's even limits on what services can be provided to a youth in a certain income brackets, if you will, or income levels affect how a person can be treated. And then, but if that history is not available or that tracking is not available, maybe someone in need on the day they turn 18, okay, now becomes maybe eligible for other different types of funding. It doesn't have the restrictions, perhaps, but if there's not the tracking to demonstrate the needs there, how are those services actually provided if they come back into the system at 18 as an adult? And I guess it's that aspect of it. I'm not an expert by any means on this, but I'm just anecdotally saying there seems to be a lot of holes in our system.
Well, yes, and there's a wonderful article in the Good News newsletter of the Juvenile Department on our multi-system collaboration group that we've put together after the technical assistance that we got. And the focus area of this group is to enhance the information system, because from what you're saying, just because a kid turns 18, they're still in high school, they're still using all these systems, but we don't have an easy, expeditious way to share information. So that's what this group is actually working on. So stay tuned. A couple of years from now, we might surprise you, because we'll be able to share things like that.
Yeah. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Sonia?
Oh, sorry. No, I'm just bad at that.
I had mentioned to you earlier, and I just want to, state again for the public, That's a great newsletter that you're putting out. I understand that's relatively new. And we spoke about how to get that to a greater audience.
Right.
So perhaps an email version or something like that might be in the future. So I'll watch for that.
Okay, well, we will look into that.
Great, thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you
very
so
For
much.
your presentation.
Thank you for your time.